My aunt wears her tightest dress whenever I bring a boyfriend to Sunday dinner, and last week she showed up in a red bodycon that was practically painted on when I introduced my fiancé Hayes. She spent the whole meal leaning over the table, touching his arm, asking about his gym routine while my mom pretended not to notice. I'm Mackenzie, 28 years old, and I watched my Aunt Judith practically grind against Hayes while reaching for the salt shaker. Her surgically enhanced breasts were spilling out of that dress, her perfectly manicured nails trailing down his forearm as she laughed at something he said about CrossFit. The entire family sat frozen around my parents' dining table, forks suspended in midair, as Judith pressed her thigh against Hayes' leg and asked if he could help her move some furniture next weekend. My mother's face had gone pale. My father suddenly found his mashed potatoes fascinating, and my younger brother actually got up and left the room. But I didn't react the way everyone expected. I didn't cry or make a scene or drag Hayes out of there. Instead, I smiled, raised my wine glass and said, "Actually, Aunt Judith, Hayes and I were hoping you could help us with something too." The predatory gleam in her eyes shifted to confusion as I pulled a manila envelope from my purse and slid it across the table. "We're finalizing our wedding guest list and wanted your input on whether we should invite Uncle Richard's mistress to the ceremony or just to the reception." The room went completely silent. Judith's hand froze on Hayes' arm, her expression morphing from confident seductress to something closer to trapped animal. My mother's wine glass actually slipped from her fingers, red wine spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. Because Uncle Richard, Judith's husband of 15 years, wasn't just any spouse. He was the senior partner at the law firm where half our extended family worked, the man who'd put 3 of my cousins through college, the golden boy who could do no wrong in my grandmother's eyes. I grew up watching Judith work her magic on every man who crossed her path, a pattern so obvious that family gatherings felt like watching a documentary on predatory behavior. She was my mother's younger sister, 42 years old but passing for early 30s thanks to aggressive cosmetic maintenance and a wardrobe that belonged in a gentleman's club. Her marriage to Richard had been the scandal of our family when I was 13, a whirlwind romance that started when she was his paralegal and ended with my mother's best friend getting quietly divorced. Judith always claimed their connection was destiny, that some loves were too powerful to ignore. What she meant was that some bank accounts were too large to resist. The first boyfriend I brought home was during college, a sweet economics major named Bennett, who blushed when my grandmother asked about his intentions. Judith showed up to that dinner in a dress so tight she could barely sit down, spent the entire meal asking Bennett about his athletic build and whether he'd ever considered modeling. He broke up with me 2 weeks later, never quite meeting my eyes when he said we wanted different things. The second was worse, a law student named Declan who Judith cornered in our kitchen during dessert, pressing herself against him while asking for help opening a wine bottle that had already been opened. I found them in the pantry, Judith's hand on his chest, her lips inches from his ear. Declan swore nothing happened, but his texts got shorter after that, his visits less frequent, until he simply stopped calling. By the time I was 25, I'd learned to warn boyfriends about Judith in advance, to schedule visits when she'd be out of town, to keep my romantic life as separate from family as possible. But Hayes was different. Hayes was supposed to be my future, the man who'd proposed on a beach in Maine with my grandmother's ring, who'd already put the down payment on our first house. I thought he was strong enough to handle Judith's games. I thought wrong. 3 months before this particular Sunday dinner, Hayes and I had announced our engagement at a family barbecue. Judith had hugged me with tears in her eyes, called me the luckiest girl in the world, told Hayes he was getting an amazing woman. Then she'd started showing up at his gym, at his favorite coffee shop, at the bar where he met colleagues after work. Just coincidence, she'd claim, flashing that surgically perfected smile. Just wanted to get to know my future nephew-in-law. Hayes thought it was sweet, evidence that my family was welcoming him. He didn't see the pattern I'd been watching my entire adult life. What Hayes also didn't know, what nobody at that table knew except me, was that I'd hired a private investigator 2 months earlier, not to follow Hayes, though I'd been tempted after Judith started her campaign. No, I'd hired someone to follow Judith. Because patterns that obvious usually came from practice, and practice required opportunity. My investigator found that opportunity at the Grandview Hotel downtown, where Judith met a rotating cast of younger men every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. Men who looked nothing like Uncle Richard with his silver hair and political connections. Men who looked a lot like my previous boyfriends, actually. The manila envelope I just placed on the table contained surveillance photos from the past 8 weeks. Judith entering the hotel with a 20-something construction worker. Judith leaving the hotel with a personal trainer whose Instagram I recognize from my gym. Judith meeting someone in the parking garage who worked as a paralegal at Richard's firm, a cruel repetition of her own origin story. But the real bomb was the final photo, the one showing Judith and a familiar-looking young man with dark hair and an athletic build, taken just 3 days ago. A man who looked remarkably like Declan, my ex-boyfriend from 2 years back. I'd spent months planning this moment, collecting evidence while playing the oblivious niece, the loving family member who still invited Judith to wedding planning sessions and asked her advice on centerpieces. I'd watched her work her magic on Hayes at family dinners, touching his shoulder, complimenting his tie, asking increasingly personal questions about his workout routine and whether he ever got lonely when I worked late. I'd seen the exact pattern I'd witnessed with Bennett and Declan and 3 other boyfriends before them. The difference was that this time, I was ready. "What is this?" Judith's voice came out strangled, her perfectly applied lipstick suddenly looking garish against her pale face. She hadn't opened the envelope yet, but she knew. Women like Judith always knew when their carefully constructed lies were about to collapse. "Wedding planning materials," I said sweetly, taking a sip of my wine while the red stain from my mother's spill crept closer to Judith's plate. "Hayes and I have been discussing how to handle delicate family situations, and we thought you might have some insight given your extensive experience with complicated relationships." My mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. My father's knuckles were white around his knife. Hayes looked between Judith and me, confusion starting to shift into something that looked like understanding. Because Hayes wasn't stupid, just trusting. And the way Judith was staring at that envelope, the way her hand had jerked back from his arm like he'd suddenly caught fire, was telling him everything he needed to know about the nature of her interest. "Mackenzie," Judith started, her voice taking on that syrupy quality she used when she wanted something. "I don't know what you think you know, but—" "Open it," I interrupted, my voice calm and cold. "Or I will. Right here, right now, in front of everyone. The thing about family secrets is that they only have power when they stay secret. Once you're willing to burn everything down, once you stop caring about awkward Thanksgivings and Christmas cards and maintaining the facade of family harmony, you become dangerous." Judith had spent decades relying on everyone's commitment to keeping the peace, to not making waves, to protecting the family's reputation. She'd never considered that someone might be willing to light the match and watch it all burn. Her hand shook as she reached for the envelope. Around the table, my family sat paralyzed, caught between the instinct to stop this confrontation and the morbid curiosity to see what came next. My brother had returned to the doorway, phone in hand, probably texting our cousins that World War III was about to break out. My grandmother, who'd been silent until now, leaned forward with an expression I'd never seen before. Something sharp and knowing that made me wonder what she'd suspected all along. Judith pulled the first photo out, and I watched the blood drain from her face, then the second, and the third. By the fourth, her hands were trembling so badly the photos scattered across the table, glossy evidence of her double life spreading out like a card trick gone wrong. My mother grabbed one reflexively, then dropped it as if burned. My father's face went from confused to understanding to absolutely furious in the space of a heartbeat. But it was the final photo that did it. The one showing Judith with Declan, the two of them entering the Grandview Hotel with his hand on her lower back, her looking up at him with the same predatory smile she'd been giving Hayes just 10 minutes earlier. The date stamp in the corner was from 6 months after Declan and I had broken up, when I'd still been crying over what I thought was my failure to keep his interest. "You did this on purpose," I said, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. "Not just with Hayes, with all of them. You deliberately seduced my boyfriends, broke up my relationships because—" I paused, letting the question hang in the air. Because why? Jealousy? Competition? Some twisted need to prove she was still desirable? "That's enough," my father said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. But he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Judith, his sister-in-law, with an expression of pure disgust. "Richard needs to see these." "No," Judith gasped, reaching across the table as if she could physically stop what was already in motion. "Please, you don't understand. It wasn't like that. You never what?" My mother's voice was ice, colder than I'd ever heard it. "Never intentionally destroyed your niece's relationships? Never deliberately went after her boyfriends? Never cheated on your husband with God knows how many men?" She stood up, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Get out of my house." Judith's eyes swung to me, desperate now, the seductress mask completely shattered. "Mackenzie, please. We're family. You can't do this to family." But I could. I'd been doing it since the moment I hired that investigator. Every smile I'd given her while planning my wedding, every time I'd asked her opinion on flowers or venue locations, every family dinner where I'd sat quietly while she flirted with Hayes, I'd been playing a long game. Collecting evidence, building my case, waiting for the perfect moment to detonate the bomb. "Hayes," I said, turning to my fiancé, who'd been sitting in stunned silence through the entire exchange. "I need you to know that I trust you. I've always trusted you. But I also needed you to see what she is, what she does. Not because I doubted you, but because you needed to understand why we can't have her at our wedding, why we can't have her in our lives." Hayes looked at the photos spread across the table, then at Judith's desperate face, then back at me. Whatever he saw in my expression made him reach for my hand, his grip tight and sure. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." Judith stood abruptly, the chair falling backward with a crash. "You're going to regret this," she spat, her beautiful face twisted with rage. "All of you. When Richard finds out that you're spreading lies about me, that you're trying to destroy my marriage." "The investigator has video too," I said calmly, pulling my phone from my purse. "Hours of it. Hotel room numbers, timestamps, the works. We can watch it right now if you'd like. I'm sure everyone would be fascinated to hear the audio from your conversation with Marcus from the gym about how naive your niece is, how easy her boyfriends are to manipulate." The color that had drained from her face returned in a hot rush of red. "You're lying." "Am I?" I pressed play on a video file, turning the volume up just loud enough for the table to hear Judith's distinctive laugh, her voice saying something about that boring little mouse, thinking she could keep a man when there were real women in the world. My mother's sob was the only sound in the room beyond Judith's recorded cruelty. My grandmother stood slowly, all 4'11" of her seeming to grow larger as she fixed Judith with a look that could strip paint. "Get out," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 78 years of seeing through people's bullshit. "And don't come back." Judith grabbed her designer purse, photos scattering as she swept them aside. At the doorway, she turned back one last time. "He'll forgive me," she said, but her voice wavered. "Richard always forgives me, and you'll all come crawling back when you need something from him." "No," my mother said, still standing by her chair, red wine staining her white blouse like a badge of honor. "We won't. And when I tell Richard's law partners about his wife's extracurricular activities, when I mention the names of the young men from his firm who appear in these photos, we'll see how forgiving he feels." The slam of the front door echoed through the house. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then my grandmother picked up the scattered photos, studying them with a clinical eye. "How long did you know?" she asked me. "Long enough," I said. "Long enough to make sure I had enough evidence that there would be no question, no benefit of the doubt, no family members taking her side because it's easier than dealing with the truth." Hayes squeezed my hand. "When were you going to tell me?" "After the wedding," I admitted. "I was going to show you everything after we were married, explain why she couldn't be part of our lives. But then she showed up tonight in that dress, and I saw her touching you the same way she'd touched all the others. And I realized I was tired of waiting. Tired of protecting everyone's feelings except my own." My father gathered the photos, his hands careful and deliberate. "I'll make copies," he said. "Richard deserves to know the kind of woman he married. The family deserves to know why she's no longer welcome at gatherings." "People will talk," my mother warned, but her voice lacked conviction. She knew as well as I did that people were already talking, had been talking for years about Judith's too tight dresses and too friendly behavior. At least now the talk would include the truth. "Let them," I said. "I'm done protecting people who've never protected me." My grandmother set down the photos and crossed to where I sat, pulling me into a hug that smelled like lavender and old-fashioned face powder. "Your grandfather would be proud," she whispered. "He never liked her either, you know. Said she reminded him of a cat playing with mice." The rest of dinner was subdued, but there was a strange sense of relief in the air, like a storm had finally broken after weeks of heavy clouds. Hayes helped my mother clean up the wine stain. My father made copies of the evidence. My brother texted updates to our cousins that would have the entire extended family buzzing within hours, and I sat at the table, running my finger along the rim of my wine glass, and planned, because this was just the beginning. Judith had spent 15 years destroying my relationships, humiliating me, making me feel like I was never enough to keep a man interested. She'd used her looks and her sexuality as weapons, convinced that her beauty gave her the right to take whatever she wanted from whoever she wanted. She'd destroyed my trust in men, my confidence in myself, my ability to believe that someone could choose me over her. But she'd made a critical mistake. She'd assumed I was weak, that I would stay silent forever, that family loyalty meant accepting abuse with a smile. She'd underestimated the power of patience, the value of evidence, the fury of a woman who'd finally decided she was done being a victim. The photos were just the opening move. What came next would be so much worse. The news spread through our family faster than I'd anticipated. By Monday morning, my phone was exploding with texts from cousins, aunts, uncles who'd all heard various versions of what happened at Sunday dinner. Some were supportive, calling Judith every name in the book and asking why I'd waited so long to expose her. Others were cautious, suggesting maybe there'd been a misunderstanding, maybe the photos weren't what they seemed. Those were the family members whose kids Richard had helped with legal issues, whose businesses had benefited from his connections, whose loyalty was purchased rather than earned. I ignored most of the messages and focused on work. I was a senior marketing analyst at a tech startup downtown, a job I'd fought hard to get and worked harder to keep. My boss, Quinn, had been understanding when I'd asked for Friday afternoon off to meet with the investigator one last time, and she'd been even more understanding when I'd come in Monday morning looking like I hadn't slept. "Family drama?" she asked, appearing at my cubicle with 2 cups of coffee. "Something like that," I said, accepting the cup gratefully. Quinn was one of those rare bosses who actually cared about her employees as humans rather than just productivity metrics. She was 45, divorced, and had zero patience for what she called patriarchal bullshit masquerading as family tradition. The aunt? She'd heard me mention Judith before, usually in the context of why I was stressed about upcoming family events. Exposed her, at dinner, in front of everyone. I pulled up the group chat where my cousins were still debating whether I'd gone too far. Now half the family thinks I'm a hero and the other half thinks I destroyed a marriage for no reason. Quinn read over my shoulder, her expression darkening. "The photos are real?" "Video too. 2 months of surveillance. She's been doing this for years, not just to me, but probably to other young women in the family. We just never talked about it because women are supposed to stay quiet when other women hurt them," Quinn finished. "Especially family. God forbid we make things awkward at Thanksgiving." That was exactly it. The unspoken rule that had governed my entire adult life had been that Judith's behavior was just Judith being Judith, that the family had to accept her flirtations and boundary violations because confronting her would create drama. Better to lose a boyfriend than cause a scene. Better to be humiliated than make things uncomfortable for everyone else. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my mother, asking me to come by the house after work. "Important," she'd written. "Your father and I need to talk to you." The knot in my stomach tightened. Part of me had expected this, the inevitable moment when my parents would ask me to reconsider, to take back the evidence, to let Judith apologize and move on. They'd spent their entire marriage avoiding conflict with my mother's family, smoothing over disagreements, prioritizing peace over principle. Why would they start fighting now? Hayes texted around noon. His message was simple. "Lunch? My place?" We met at his apartment, a modern 1-bedroom in a complex near the river. He'd been quiet since Sunday, processing what he'd seen and heard. When I arrived, he had takeout from the Thai place I loved, but I could tell from his expression that food wasn't really the point of this meeting. "I talked to my brother this morning," he said, handing me a container of Pad CU. "Told him what happened. He asked me why you didn't tell me sooner about your aunt's pattern." My chest tightened. "And what did you say?" "I said I didn't know. So I'm asking you now. Why didn't you warn me before I met her?" I set down the food, appetite disappearing. Because every time I warned someone, they thought I was being paranoid or jealous or insecure. Bennett told me I had trust issues. Declan said I was projecting my family dysfunction onto normal, friendly behavior. By the time I met you, I was tired of being the crazy girlfriend who couldn't handle her aunt being friendly. Hayes sat across from me, his elbows on his knees. "But you hired an investigator. You knew she was going to make a move." "I suspected, and I wanted proof, not just for you, but for me, for every boyfriend she'd stolen, every relationship she'd destroyed. I wanted evidence that it wasn't me, that I wasn't unlovable or boring or whatever she made me feel like I was. You should have trusted me." "I did trust you," I shot back, feeling heat rise in my face. "I trusted you not to fall for her games, which you didn't. What I didn't trust was your ability to see her for what she was without proof. Nobody ever sees it until it's too late." He was quiet for a long moment, processing. "The investigator must have cost a fortune. Every penny of my savings. 2 months of 24/7 surveillance, video equipment, everything documented and timestamped. It was worth it." "Was it?" He looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes I didn't like. Not anger, but something closer to concern. "Mackenzie, you spent months collecting evidence on your aunt instead of just cutting her out of your life. You planned this whole confrontation, timed it perfectly for maximum damage. That's not normal." The words hit like a slap. "She's been destroying my relationships for a decade. She earned what happened. I'm not saying she didn't. I'm saying that the amount of energy you put into this, the planning, the patience, it's..." He struggled for the right word. "Intense. And I need to know if this is who you are. If this is what happens when someone hurts you." I stood up, suddenly furious. "You saw what she did. You sat there at that table while she practically groped you in front of my entire family. She's done this to me over and over, and nobody stopped her. Nobody protected me. So yes, I protected myself. And if that makes me intense or crazy or whatever you're thinking right now, then maybe you should reconsider the engagement." Hayes stood too, running his hand through his hair. "That's not what I'm saying. I just need to understand if this is going to be your response to every problem we face. If someone hurts you, do you immediately start planning their destruction? Only if they deserve it. And who decides that? You?" We stared at each other across the coffee table, the Thai food cooling between us, and I realized this was the first real fight of our relationship. Everything else had been minor disagreements about wedding colors or where to spend holidays. This was different. This was Hayes seeing a side of me I'd kept carefully hidden, the part of me that was willing to be ruthless when necessary. "I should go," I said, grabbing my purse. "I have to meet my parents anyway. Mackenzie, we can talk later, when you've decided if you can handle being engaged to someone who fights back." I left before he could respond, my hands shaking as I drove across town to my parents' house. The afternoon sun was harsh, making my eyes water. Or maybe that was something else. Hayes' words kept replaying in my head. "That's not normal." As if normal had ever worked for me. As if being normal and trusting and believing the best in people had done anything except leave me heartbroken and humiliated. My parents were waiting in the living room, the same room where Sunday dinner had exploded. The wine stain was gone from the tablecloth, but I could still see the ghost of it, a faint shadow that no amount of bleach could fully erase. "Sit down, honey," my mother said, her voice gentle but strained. She looked like she'd aged 5 years since Sunday, new lines around her eyes and mouth. "Richard called this morning," my father said without preamble. "Judith showed him the photos." My stomach dropped. And he's filing for divorce. He's also conducting an internal investigation at his firm about the young paralegal in the photos. There's talk of ethics violations, conflicts of interest. My father's expression was grim. 3 of your cousins work at that firm, Mackenzie. If this investigation spreads, if it becomes public, they could lose their jobs. There it was, the real reason for this meeting. Not concern for me, but concern for the family's reputation, for the cousins who'd benefited from Uncle Richard's generosity. That's not my fault, I said, my voice flat. I didn't force Judith to sleep with her husband's employees. I just documented what she was already doing. But you made it public, my mother said, her voice cracking. You could have shown Richard privately, handled this without humiliating Judith in front of the entire family. Why? The question came out sharper than I intended. Why does she deserve privacy or dignity when she never gave me any? When she deliberately destroyed my relationships and laughed about it? Because she's family, my father said, as if that explained everything. Because we don't air our dirty laundry in public. Because there are consequences to these actions that go beyond just you and Judith. I looked between my parents, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. They weren't upset about what Judith had done to me. They were upset that I'd made them deal with it, that I'd forced them to take sides, that I'd disrupted the carefully maintained fiction, that everything was fine. You want me to apologize? I said slowly. You want me to say I went too far, that I should have handled this differently. We want you to understand that your actions have ripple effects, my mother said. Your cousins, your grandmother who's been crying for 2 days, Richard's reputation in the community. What about my reputation? I interrupted. What about all the times I was the one crying because another boyfriend had mysteriously lost interest after a family dinner? What about the years I spent thinking something was wrong with me? We know Judith was inappropriate, my father said carefully, but destroying her marriage, potentially destroying her husband's career, that's justice, I finished. That's called consequences. And if Richard's career can't survive his wife's behavior being exposed, maybe the career was the problem to begin with. The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother's eyes filled with tears, and I waited for my father to yell, to tell me I was being unreasonable. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the street. Your grandmother wants to change her will, he said quietly. She's planning to cut Judith out entirely. Leave her portion to you and your brother instead. I hadn't expected that. My grandmother was old-fashioned, big on family unity and forgiveness. The fact that she was willing to disinherit her own daughter-in-law spoke volumes about how seriously she took what I'd revealed. Mackenzie, my mother tried again. We're not saying Judith didn't do wrong. We're just asking you to consider whether the punishment fits the crime. She targeted me for a decade, I said, standing to leave. She systematically destroyed my relationships, humiliated me, made me doubt myself. And you're asking if the punishment fits the crime? The crime is ongoing. It didn't stop until I made it stop. I walked to the door, my parents making no move to follow. At the threshold, I turned back. You know what the worst part is? You're more worried about Judith's feelings and Richard's reputation than you ever were about me being hurt. You watched her do this to me for years, and you did nothing, so forgive me if I don't feel particularly concerned about the consequences she's facing now. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. My phone was ringing constantly, family members calling to weigh in, to lecture, to demand explanations. I silenced it and drove in the direction of my building, but found myself taking a different turn, heading toward the Grandview Hotel instead. The hotel was downtown, 15 stories of glass and steel that catered to business travelers and people having affairs. The parking garage where the investigator had captured some of the most damning photos was nearly empty on a Monday afternoon. I parked and sat there staring at the elevator bank where Judith had been photographed dozens of times with different men. My phone buzzed, a text from a number I didn't recognize. This is Declan. Heard about what happened at your family dinner. Can we talk? My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Declan. The law student Judith had seduced 2 years ago. One of the photos that had scattered across the dinner table Sunday night. Part of me wanted to delete the message to keep moving forward without looking back. But another part, the part that had spent 2 months collecting evidence, wanted answers. "How did you get my number?" I typed back. "Your cousin Marcus. He thought I should know that you exposed what Judith did. I think we need to talk about what happened between us." I stared at the message, my heart pounding. Because if Declan was reaching out, if he was ready to admit what had happened, that meant there were more pieces to this story than I'd realized. Judith's pattern wasn't just about seduction. It was about something darker. Something I was only beginning to understand. "Meet me at the coffee shop on 5th Street. 1 hour." I put the car in drive and headed back into the daylight, my mind racing. The evidence I'd collected was just the surface. What I was about to discover would change everything. Declan looked different than I remembered. 2 years had hardened him somehow, added weight to his shoulders and shadows under his eyes. He was waiting at a corner table when I arrived, 2 cups of coffee already ordered. The coffee shop was busy with the after-work crowd, anonymous enough that nobody would notice or care about our conversation. "Thanks for meeting me," he said as I sat down. His hands were wrapped around his cup like he needed the warmth, even though it was 70 degrees outside. "You said we needed to talk about what happened." I didn't bother with pleasantries. "So, talk." He took a breath, seeming to gather courage. "I saw the photos that are circulating in your family group chats, the ones from the hotel. I'm in Judithal of them." "I know, I saw them too. Sunday night, scattered across my parents' dinner table. Mackenzie, I need you to understand something about that time." His voice dropped lower. "What happened between Judith and me? It wasn't what you thought. It wasn't an affair." I felt my jaw tighten. "Really? Because the photos show you entering a hotel room with my aunt. That seems pretty clear." "It was blackmail," he said flatly. The word hung between us like a grenade with the pin pulled. "What?" "After that dinner at your parents' house, where she cornered me in the pantry, she started texting me. At first it seemed innocent, asking how school was going, whether I needed any legal advice for my internship applications. Then the messages got more suggestive. I told her I wasn't interested, that I was dating you and loved you." He paused, his knuckles white around the coffee cup. "She sent me photos of myself. Photos I didn't know existed, from the pantry that night. Cameras I didn't know were there. She'd positioned her phone to make it look like I was the one making advances on her." My blood went cold. "She recorded you?" "Video and photos, taken from angles that made it look like I was groping her, kissing her. She said if I didn't meet her at the hotel, she'd send them to you, to your parents, to the law school's ethics board. She said she'd ruin my career before it started." I sat back in my chair, my mind reeling. "So you went. 3 times. Each time she said it would be the last time, that she just needed to feel wanted, that her husband didn't appreciate her. Each time she took more photos, created more Judith. By the 3rd meeting, I realized she wasn't ever going to stop. So I broke up with you instead." His voice cracked. "I thought if I wasn't your boyfriend anymore, she'd lose interest and leave me alone. Did it work? For a while. Then she started showing up at the law library, at the bar where I studied. Always with that same smile, always dropping hints that she could still destroy me if she wanted to. I started avoiding places I thought she might be, changed my routine. Eventually, I transferred to a different law school in a different state just to get away from her." The coffee shop noise faded into background static. I was seeing Judith's pattern with new eyes, understanding that what I'd witnessed was just the visible part of a much darker operation. "How many others do you think there were?" "I don't know. But when I saw the photos from your investigation, I recognized some of the guys. One of them was in my study group. Another was a paralegal at the firm where I interned. We never talked about it because—" He stopped, shame coloring his face. "Because men don't talk about being blackmailed for sex. We're supposed to want it, right? We're supposed to be grateful when an attractive woman pays attention to us. That's not how consent works. I know that now. But when you're 24 and someone with power over your professional future is threatening you, you don't exactly feel empowered to say no." He finally met my eyes. I'm sorry. I should have told you the truth instead of just disappearing. I thought I was protecting you, but I was really just protecting myself. I thought about all the times I'd cried over Declan, convinced I'd done something wrong to lose him. The therapy sessions where I'd analyzed every interaction, trying to figure out what I'd said or done to push him away. The years of diminished self-esteem that had followed. She destroyed us, I said quietly. Both of us. And she didn't even care. That's why I'm here. Your cousin said you exposed her, that you had evidence. I want to help. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a folder I couldn't see. I kept everything. Every text message, every email, every voicemail where she threatened me. I couldn't delete them because I was too afraid she'd come back. But now we can add coercion and sexual exploitation to the list of things she's done. I finished. How many messages are there? Hundreds. Over 18 months. He turned his phone so I could see the screenshots. Judith's number, her words dripping with threats disguised as flirtation. You wouldn't want your girlfriend to see these photos, would you? Just one more meeting and I'll delete everything. You know what happens to law students who get accused of sexual misconduct. Your career would be over before it started. My hands started shaking. Not from fear or sadness, but from pure rage. Because this wasn't just about stolen boyfriends anymore. This was about a predator who'd systematically targeted young men, used their careers as legitimate, and destroyed lives for her own entertainment. There's something else, Declan said, his voice barely above a whisper. The last time we met at the hotel, she slipped something into my drink. I remember feeling dizzy, disoriented. When I woke up, she was gone and there were more photos. Photos I don't remember being taken. He closed his eyes. I think she drugged me. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too bright. Did you get tested? Report it? To who? I'd been meeting her voluntarily for months by that point. My texts looked like I was a willing participant. Who was going to believe me? The bitterness in his voice was cutting. I tried to convince myself it didn't happen, that I'd just had too much to drink. But I've never blacked out before, or since. I pulled out my phone and called the investigator I'd hired, a woman named Patricia who specialized in cases involving wealthy individuals. She answered on the second ring. Mackenzie, I was wondering when you'd call back. I need you to look into something else, I said, watching Declan's face across the table. Potential drugging, coercion, possibly multiple victims. Can you get toxicology reports from hotel stays if I have dates and room numbers? If the rooms were paid for with a credit card and there's any kind of incident report, yes. But we're talking about potential criminal charges here, not just civil. You'd need to involve police. Not yet. I need to know how deep this goes first. How many victims? How long the pattern's been active? I paused. Can you find out if Judith had access to any kind of sedative medications? Prescriptions in her name or her husband's? I can try. This investigation just got a lot more expensive and a lot more serious. Bill me whatever it costs. I want every detail. After I hung up, Declan was staring at me with something like awe. You're really going after her, not just for what she did to your relationships, but for all of it. She's a predator, I said simply, and predators don't stop until someone stops them. My phone buzzed with a text from Hayes. We need to talk. Tonight. Please. I silenced it. Whatever Hayes needed to say could wait. Right now, I had more important things to focus on than whether my fiancé thought I was too intense. Over the next 2 hours, Declan and I built a timeline of Judith's activities. He provided names of other young men he'd seen her with at the law school, at the firm, at various bars and restaurants around town. Some were willing to talk, he thought. Others had moved away or changed their lives so completely to escape her that they might not want to relive the trauma. There's a guy named Marcus, Declan said, checking his notes. He was a paralegal at Richard's firm, one of the men in your photos. He quit suddenly about 6 months ago, told everyone he was moving to Seattle for a better opportunity. But I ran into him at a conference last month and he was a mess, drinking too much, jumping at shadows. When I mentioned Judith's name, he literally left the conference. Can you reach out to him? Tell him what we're doing? I can try. But Mackenzie, you need to understand what you're getting into. If even half of what I suspect is true, Judith didn't just seduce young men. She systematically targeted people with something to lose and destroyed them when they tried to resist. People with careers on the line, reputations to protect, families who wouldn't understand. Then they'll understand why we need to stop her, I said, before she does it to someone else. When I finally left the coffee shop, it was nearly dark. I drove home on autopilot, my mind churning through the implications of what Declan had revealed. The investigation I'd started as revenge for stolen boyfriends had morphed into something far bigger and far darker. My apartment felt empty when I walked in. Hayes had a key, but he wasn't there waiting like he sometimes did after we fought. I checked my phone and found 3 more missed calls from him, plus a voicemail. Mackenzie, I know you're probably still angry about this afternoon, but please call me back. I've been thinking about what you said, about fighting back, and I need to apologize for how I reacted. I didn't understand the full scope of what Judith had done. Your cousin Marcus called me. He told me about some things that happened to other guys in the family. I think I was wrong about you being too intense. Call me when you can. I almost called him back. Almost. But there was too much spinning in my head, too many new pieces of information to process. Instead, I opened my laptop and started a new document, beginning to organize everything I knew about Judith's pattern. The doorbell rang around 9. Through the peephole, I saw Hayes standing in the hallway with takeout bags and flowers. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. I'm sorry, he said, before I could speak. For this afternoon, for making you feel like you were wrong to protect yourself. Your cousin explained some things about your aunt that you never told me, probably because you were trying to protect me from knowing how bad it really was. What did Marcus tell you? I asked, letting him inside. That Judith targeted him when he first started at the law firm. That she made his life hell for months, threatened his job, sent inappropriate messages. He finally transferred to the Seattle office just to get away from her. Hayes set down the food and turned to me. He said there were others. That everyone knew Judith was predatory, but nobody talked about it because Uncle Richard is so powerful. She blackmailed them, I said flatly. Took photos, made threats, ruined careers. Declan told me everything today. She's not just a flirt or a homewrecker. She's a criminal. Hayes' face went pale. Declan? Your ex from 2 years ago? He reached out after Sunday. Wanted to explain what really happened between us. Why he really broke up with me. I told Hayes everything Declan had shared, watching his expression shift from shock to horror to cold fury. She drugged him? That's what he thinks. Patricia is investigating, trying to get evidence. But Hayes, if this is true, if she's been doing this to multiple men for years, this isn't just about my family anymore. This is criminal enterprise. He sat down heavily on my couch. What are you going to do? I'm going to find every single victim, document every crime, build a case so airtight that when I take it to the police, they won't have any choice but to prosecute. I sat next to him. I know you think I'm too intense about this, that I'm taking it too far. I don't think that anymore, he interrupted. I think you're exactly intense enough. This woman is dangerous and someone needs to stop her. He took my hand. But I need you to promise me something. Promise that you'll let me help instead of trying to do this all alone. And promise that when this is over, we'll find our way back to planning a wedding instead of planning someone's downfall. I wanted to promise that. Wanted to believe that there would be an after, a time when I could focus on being Hayes' wife instead of being Judith's nemesis. But the truth was, I'd crossed a line Sunday night when I'd put those photos on the table. There was no going back to normal, no return to the person I'd been before. I promised to let you help, I said carefully. The rest, we'll figure out as we go. He kissed my forehead, and we ate cold Thai food while I showed him the timeline I'd been building. By midnight, we had a plan. Declan would reach out to Marcus and any other victims he could identify. Patricia would investigate Judith's access to sedatives and analyze hotel security footage from the dates Declan had provided. I would compile everything into a comprehensive report. And Hayes would do what he did best. Research the legal framework we'd need to make the charges stick. What about your family? He asked as we were cleaning up. They're not going to like where this is heading. They didn't like Sunday either. At this point, I've already burned those bridges. Might as well make it count. But even as I said it, I felt the weight of what I was doing. My parents were right about one thing. My actions had consequences that rippled far beyond just me and Judith. Uncle Richard's firm, my cousin's jobs, my grandmother's will, family gatherings that would never be the same. I was dismantling the careful structure my family had built over decades, exposing secrets they'd worked hard to keep buried. The question was whether the truth was worth the destruction. And every time I thought about Declan's face when he described being blackmailed, every time I remembered the years I'd spent thinking I was the problem, the answer was the same. Yes, it was worth it. All of it. My phone buzzed one more time before I went to bed. A text from a number with a Seattle area code. This is Marcus. Declan said you're collecting information about Judith. I have recordings. Call me when you can talk. I stared at the message, my heart pounding. Recordings. Evidence I hadn't even known existed. I forwarded the message to Patricia with instructions to reach out first thing in the morning, then turned off my phone. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, I let myself feel the full weight of what I'd started, the chain reaction that was already spreading through my family like wildfire. Somewhere across town, Judith was probably scrambling, calling lawyers, trying to figure out how to contain the damage. She had no idea how much worse it was about to get. The package arrived at my office 3 days later. Marcus had overnighted it from Seattle, a flash drive containing over 40 audio recordings of his interactions with Judith. I locked my office door, put in my headphones, and started listening. The first recording was dated 18 months ago. Judith's voice honey-sweet as she congratulated Marcus on his new position at the firm. The second was from 3 days later, her tone shifting to something more intimate as she invited him to coffee. By the fifth recording, she was threatening him. You seemed very interested in me during our meeting yesterday, Marcus. I have photos that show exactly how interested you were. It would be a shame if your boss saw them and got the wrong idea about your professionalism. I never touched you. You know that's not what happened. I know what the photos show, and they show you standing very close to me, your hand on my waist, looking at me like, well, let's just say HR would have questions. The recording quality was surprisingly good. Marcus must have been using a phone app, capturing every word. Over the next 2 hours, I listened to Judith systematically destroy a young man's confidence, threaten his career, coerce him into meetings he clearly didn't want to attend. The worst was a recording from a hotel room. Judith's voice was slurred, asking Marcus to help her with her zipper. His voice was panicked, trying to leave. Then there was the sound of ice clinking in a glass, Judith insisting he have a drink to relax. The recording cut off abruptly, resuming 15 minutes later with Marcus sounding confused and Judith laughing. You're so tense, sweetheart. Just relax and let this happen. Nobody will ever know. I don't feel right. Something's wrong. You're fine. Just a little tipsy. Here, let me help you. The recording ended. I sat in my office chair, feeling sick. This wasn't just blackmail or coercion. This was sexual assault. Judith had drugged Marcus, just like Declan suspected she'd drugged him. I called Patricia immediately. I need you to prioritize the toxicology investigation. We have audio evidence of Judith drugging at least one victim, possibly more. Send me the files, I'll have my tech analyst clean up the audio and verify authenticity. But Mackenzie, at this level of evidence, you need to involve law enforcement. This is beyond a civil case. Not yet. I want to know how many victims there are, how long this has been happening. If we go to the police now with just 2 cases, Judith's lawyers will tear it apart. But if we can show a pattern over years, multiple victims, systematic predation, then it becomes impossible to defend against, Patricia finished. All right. But we're on a timeline now. The longer you wait to report this, the harder it gets to justify why you didn't go to police immediately. After I hung up, I forwarded the recordings to Hayes with a warning about their content. Then I texted Marcus. Thank you for trusting me with these. I'm so sorry for what she did to you. His response came quickly. Don't be sorry. Just make sure she pays for it. I've got 3 other names for you, guys who worked at the firm or knew Richard through business. They might talk if they know others are coming forward. The dam was breaking. Over the next week, Patricia and I interviewed 7 men who'd been targeted by Judith over the past 5 years. Their stories were horrifyingly similar. Initial friendly contact, escalating flirtation, manufactured compromising situations, threats of exposure, coerced sexual encounters. 3 of them had evidence, recordings, or text messages they'd kept as insurance. 2 had transferred to different cities to escape her. 1 had quit the legal profession entirely, so traumatized by the experience that he couldn't face working in an environment where he might encounter Judith or people like her. She told me Richard knew, that one said during our video call. His name was Owen, and he'd been a junior associate at the firm 3 years ago. She said her husband understood that she had needs he couldn't meet, that he was fine with her having discreet arrangements with younger men. She made it sound sophisticated, like some kind of open marriage agreement. Did you ever verify that with Richard? I asked. God, no. You don't question a senior partner about his sex life when you're trying to make partner yourself. I just assumed she was telling the truth. He paused. Was she? I doubt it. Richard's filing for divorce and conducting an ethics investigation at the firm. That doesn't sound like someone who knew and approved. The ethics investigation had become public knowledge 3 days after Sunday dinner. Local legal publications were reporting on irregularities at Richard's firm, though they were being careful not to name names yet. My 3 cousins who worked there were in damage control mode, 2 of them lawyering up in case they became targets of the investigation. My extended family had fractured into clear camps, Team Mackenzie and Team Judith. Group chats that used to coordinate holiday gatherings now served as battlegrounds for increasingly vicious arguments. My mother's side of the family, Judith's blood relatives, were circling the wagons, insisting that I'd misunderstood, that the photos could be explained, that Judith was being unfairly persecuted. My father's side, never particularly fond of Judith to begin with, was firmly in my corner. My grandmother had officially changed her will, cutting Judith out entirely and redistributing her assets to other family members. She'd also stopped speaking to her own son, my uncle by marriage, who'd tried to convince her that I was exaggerating. The family was imploding, exactly as my parents had feared, and I couldn't bring myself to care. Hayes had become my unlikely ally in all this. His legal research had uncovered precedents for prosecuting cases like Judith's, particularly when there was evidence of drugging and systematic predation. He'd also connected me with a prosecutor he knew from law school, a woman named Jennifer who specialized in sex crimes. She'll want to see all your evidence, Hayes said during one of our late-night planning sessions, and she'll probably want to coordinate with the police before you go public with any of this. I'm not going public yet. I want Richard to know first. Hayes looked up from his laptop. Why? Because he deserves to know what kind of woman he married, and because if he has any decency at all, he'll help us build the case against her. Mackenzie, he's already filing for divorce. His law firm is under investigation. What makes you think he'll cooperate instead of trying to bury this to protect his reputation? Because I'm going to give him a choice. Help us prosecute Judith and save some of his reputation, or obstruct the investigation and go down with her when this becomes public. The meeting with Richard took place at his lawyer's office, neutral territory where we could talk without Judith knowing. Richard looked like he'd aged a decade in the past 2 weeks. His silver hair seemed grayer, his expensive suit hanging a bit looser on his frame. I don't understand what more you want from me, he said after his lawyer had explained why we were there. I'm divorcing Judith. I'm cooperating with the Bar Association's investigation. What else is there? I slid a folder across the table. There's the fact that your wife has been systematically sexually assaulting young men for at least 5 years, using your firm and your reputation as Judith G. His face went white as he opened the folder and saw the first page of victim statements. That's not possible. Judith may have had affairs, but she wouldn't. Listen to this, I said, pulling out my phone and playing 30 seconds of Marcus's recording. Judith's voice filled the office, sickeningly sweet as she threatened to destroy Marcus's career if he didn't meet her at the hotel. Richard's hands started shaking. How many? 7 that we've identified so far. 3 have physical evidence of being drugged. All of them have recordings or text messages showing coercion and blackmail. I paused. One of them was a paralegal at your firm who quit 6 months ago. 2 others were summer associates who left before completing their programs. How many promising careers has she destroyed, Richard? How many young men have given up on law entirely because of what she did to them? His lawyer, a sharp woman named Catherine, leaned forward. If this is true, why haven't any of these men gone to the police? Because they were afraid, Hayes answered. Afraid of being laughed at, afraid of losing their careers, afraid that no one would believe them because the predator was a woman and they were men. But that fear ends now. Richard was still staring at the victim statements, his face pale. She used my firm, my reputation, to target these boys. Men, I corrected. They were men, young men trying to build careers, just like you were once. And your wife saw them as prey. What do you want from me? His voice was hollow. I want you to provide access to your wife's phone records, credit card statements, anything that can help us establish a pattern of behavior. I want you to speak to the prosecutor I'm working with and provide testimony about Judith's access to prescription medications. And I want you to stop thinking of yourself as the victim here, because you're not. You married a predator. Yes, but you also built the environment where she could hunt. Catherine started to object, but Richard held up his hand. She's right. I knew Judith flirted with the young associates. I knew she made them uncomfortable. I told myself it was harmless, that she was just friendly, that men who couldn't handle a little flirtation weren't suited for high-pressure legal work. He closed the folder, unable to look at it anymore. I'll cooperate. Whatever you need. Richard, Catherine warned. No, I spent 30 years building a reputation in this community. I won't have it said that I protected someone who did this, even if that someone was my wife. He looked at me directly for the first time. I'm sorry. For what she did to you, to these young men, for creating an environment where she felt entitled to do it. I'm sorry. The apology meant less than he probably thought it did, but the cooperation meant everything. Over the next week, Richard provided phone records showing hundreds of calls and texts to the men Judith had targeted. Credit card statements confirmed hotel room bookings on dates that matched victim accounts. Most damning of all, Richard admitted that Judith had access to prescription anxiety medication and sleeping pills that he'd been prescribed but never used. Patricia's investigator found hotel security footage showing Judith meeting with various young men, the timestamps matching victim accounts of coerced encounters. The tech analyst verified that the audio recordings were authentic and unaltered. By the end of week 3, we had a case file 6 inches thick. 7 victims with corroborating evidence, a pattern of behavior spanning 5 years, documentation of drugging, blackmail, coercion, and sexual assault. It was, as Hayes put it, a prosecutor's dream case. Jennifer, the prosecutor Hayes had connected me with, reviewed everything over a marathon 8-hour meeting. When she finally closed the last folder, she looked at me with something like awe. This is the most thoroughly documented sex crime case I've seen in 15 years, she said. Most of these cases collapse because there's no physical evidence, no witnesses, no pattern. You've provided all 3. So, you'll prosecute? I asked. I'll present it to the grand jury next week. With this level of evidence, I'd be shocked if they didn't indict. She paused. You should know that this is going to become very public very quickly. Once the indictment is issued, the media will pick it up. Your family's name, Richard's firm, all of it will be in the news. Good, I said. Let everyone know what she is. Hayes squeezed my hand under the table. We'd had this conversation multiple times over the past 3 weeks. The reality that prosecuting Judith would mean destroying what remained of my family's reputation. Some cousins would never speak to me again. Family gatherings would be impossible. The name that my parents had worked so hard to build in the community would become associated with scandal and criminal behavior. But every time I wavered, I thought about Marcus's recordings, about Declan's face when he described being blackmailed, about Owen quitting law entirely because of what Judith had done to him. Their lives mattered more than my family's reputation. The grand jury indictment came down on a Thursday morning. Judith was charged with 7 counts of sexual assault, 9 counts of coercion, 14 counts of blackmail, and 3 counts of administering drugs without consent. The bail was set at $500,000, high enough that even with Richard's resources, it took 2 days to post. By Thursday afternoon, every major news outlet in the state was covering the story. Prominent attorney's wife charged in sexual assault case read one headline. Pattern of predation. How one woman allegedly targeted young men in legal community, read another. My phone was blowing up with interview requests. Family members demanding to know why I'd done this. Strangers thanking me for coming forward. I ignored all of it and went to Hayes' apartment, where we watched the news co-Judith G. in silence. Your mother called me, Hayes said during a commercial break. She's begging me to convince you to recant your statement. Say there was a misunderstanding. What did you tell her? That there was no misunderstanding, that her sister-in-law is a predator who destroyed lives and deserves to be prosecuted. He muted the TV. She hung up on me. I'm sorry, I said. This is affecting you too, and you didn't sign up for... I signed up for you, he interrupted. All of you, including the part that fights back when people hurt the ones you love. I'm not going anywhere. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, Judith's lawyer was doing exactly what we'd expected, trying the case in the court of public opinion. Interviews where Judith claimed she was the victim of a vindictive niece, op-eds about the dangers of believing accusers without question, carefully worded statements suggesting that the young men had been willing participants who only claimed assault after regretting their choices. But we had something Judith's lawyer didn't have. 7 victims willing to testify, corroborating evidence, and a pattern so clear that no amount of spin could explain it away. The night before the preliminary hearing, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Sunday dinner, about the moment I'd slid that envelope across the table, about Judith's face when she realized her carefully constructed life was about to collapse. That had been the beginning. Tomorrow would be something else entirely. Tomorrow, Judith would sit in a courtroom and hear victim after victim describe what she'd done. Tomorrow, the world would see her for what she truly was, and I would be there to watch every second of it. The courthouse steps were mobbed with reporters when we arrived. Hayes kept his arm around me as we pushed through the crowd, ignoring shouted questions about whether I hated my aunt, whether this was really about family drama, whether I understood the seriousness of the charges I'd helped bring. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Richard sat in the back row, his lawyer beside him, looking like a man attending his own funeral. My parents were notably absent, as were most of my mother's side of the family. But my father's relatives filled 3 rows, my grandmother sitting in the front, her spine straight as steel despite her 78 years. Judith entered in handcuffs, her lawyer arguing loudly that this was unnecessary for someone who'd posted bail. But the judge, a stern woman named Patricia Holloway, wasn't having it. This was a hearing to determine if there was enough evidence to proceed to trial, and she was going to run it by the book. The first victim to testify was Marcus. He took the stand with visible nerves, his hands shaking as he was sworn in. But his voice was steady as he described meeting Judith, the escalating threats, the hotel encounter where she'd drugged him. Did you consent to sexual activity with the defendant? The prosecutor Jennifer asked. No, I was unconscious for part of it and barely coherent for the rest. I couldn't have consented even if I'd wanted to. Judith's lawyer, a slick man named Thompson, tried to suggest that Marcus had pursued Judith, that his recordings were taken out of context. But when Jennifer played the full audio of Judith threatening to destroy Marcus's career, the courtroom went silent. Declan testified next, describing the photos Judith had taken without his knowledge, the months of blackmail, his eventual transfer to another school to escape her. He broke down when describing the night he suspected he'd been drugged, his voice cracking as he admitted how ashamed he'd been, how he'd blamed himself. Young men aren't supposed to be victims, he said, tears streaming down his face. We're supposed to want sex with attractive women, supposed to be grateful for the attention, but I didn't want it. I never wanted it. And she made me feel like I was the one who was broken for not wanting it. One by one, 5 more victims took the stand. Each told variations of the same story: Judith's initial friendliness, the manufactured compromising situations, the threats, the coercion, the assaults. 2 described waking up in hotel rooms with no memory of how they'd gotten there. 1 described Judith showing him photos she'd taken while he was unconscious, using them to force him into additional encounters. By the lunch recess, Judith's composure was cracking. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the pallor of her skin, the way her hands shook when she reached for water. Her lawyer was conferring urgently with her, probably trying to convince her that a plea deal was looking better by the minute. The afternoon session brought expert testimony. A toxicologist explained how the sedatives found in Judith's possession could incapacitate someone within 15 minutes, create memory gaps, make resistance impossible. A psychologist testified about the trauma patterns consistent with coerced sexual encounters, how victims often blame themselves rather than recognizing they'd been assaulted. Then it was my turn. I'd been dreading this, knowing that Judith's lawyer would try to paint me as a jealous niece seeking revenge over stolen boyfriends. I'd prepared for days with Jennifer, practicing how to stay calm under cross-examination. Thompson started exactly as we'd expected. "Miss Mackenzie, isn't it true that you've harbored resentment toward your aunt for years?" "Yes," I said calmly, "because she deliberately destroyed my relationships and traumatized me." "But you didn't know about these alleged assaults until recently, correct? Your initial investigation was motivated by personal grievance over romantic relationships?" "My initial investigation was motivated by a pattern of behavior I'd witnessed for a decade. I suspected my aunt was doing something harmful, and I was right. The fact that the harm was worse than I'd realized doesn't make the investigation invalid." "You spent tens of thousands of dollars on private investigators, hired lawyers, compiled evidence. Some might say you were obsessed with destroying your aunt's marriage." "Some might say I was protecting future victims," I countered. 7 men gave testimony today. How many more would there have been if I hadn't stopped her?" Thompson tried sejudicial more angles, suggesting I'd manipulated the victims, coaching them on their testimony, exaggerating evidence. But every time he attacked, Jennifer was there with documentation. Authentic recordings, verified timestamps, corroborating witnesses. The final blow came when Jennifer called Richard to the stand. Judith's face went ashen as her soon-to-be ex-husband was sworn in. "Mr. Walker, how long were you married to the defendant?" 15 years. "During that time, were you aware of your wife's interactions with young male employees at your firm?" Richard's voice was heavy with shame. "I was aware that she flirted with them. I told myself it was harmless, that she was just being friendly. I didn't want to believe it was more than that." "When did you first learn about the extent of her activities?" "When my niece showed me photographs and recordings 3 weeks ago. Before that, I'd convinced myself that any rumors were exaggerations, that people were jealous of Judith's beauty and confidence." He paused. "I was wrong. I enabled her by refusing to see what she was doing." "Did your wife have access to prescription medications that could be used to incapacitate someone?" "Yes. I was prescribed anxiety medication and sleeping pills for insomnia. I rarely used them, but Judith had access to the bottles. Did you ever give your wife permission to use those medications on other people?" "Absolutely not." Thompson tried to suggest that Richard was only testifying to protect his own reputation, that he was colluding with me to destroy Judith. But Richard's pain was too evident, his shame too real. This wasn't a man protecting himself. This was a man who'd finally seen the truth and was horrified by what he'd allowed to happen. Judge Holloway took less than an hour to make her ruling. Based on the evidence presented today, this court finds sufficient cause to bind the defendant over for trial on all charges. Bail is revoked pending trial due to the severity of the charges and the defendant's demonstrated pattern of predatory behavior. The bailiff moved to take Judith into custody. She stood on shaking legs, her expensive outfit looking suddenly cheap under the courtroom's harsh lights. As the handcuffs clicked into place, she looked directly at me for the first time all day. "This is your fault," she hissed. "All of it. You destroyed my life because you couldn't keep a boyfriend." I stood, Hayes' hand on my shoulder, and met her gaze without flinching. "No, Judith. You destroyed your life by being a predator. I just made sure everyone knew what you were." As they led her away, my grandmother stood and started clapping. Slowly, the victims in the courtroom joined her, then Richard, then my father's relatives, until the whole room was applauding. Not for me, but for the 7 men who'd had the courage to testify, who'd relived their trauma in public so that justice could be served. Outside the courthouse, Jennifer addressed the press while Hayes and I stood slightly behind her. Today's hearing demonstrated what happens when victims find the courage to come forward and when evidence is properly gathered and presented. The defendant will face trial for multiple counts of sexual assault, and we are confident in our case. A reporter called out, "What message does this send about female-on-male sexual assault?" "The same message as any sexual assault case," Jennifer replied. "That consent is required regardless of gender, that predators will be prosecuted regardless of gender, and that victims deserve justice regardless of gender." As we walked to the car, I saw my mother standing by the courthouse entrance. She looked older than I'd ever seen her eyes red from crying. She took a step toward me, then stopped, as if unsure whether she was welcome to approach. I paused, Hayes stopping with me. "Mom." "I saw the testimony," she said, her voice breaking. "I heard what she did to those boys, to Declan. I never knew, Mackenzie. I swear I never knew it was that bad." "You didn't want to know," I said, not cruelly, just stating fact. "None of you did. It was easier to believe I was jealous or paranoid than to confront what Judith really was. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for not protecting you, for not believing you." Tears were streaming down her face now. "Can you forgive me?" I thought about all the years of crying over stolen boyfriends, all the times I'd tried to explain Judith's pattern only to be dismissed. The pain of not being believed had cut deeper than Judith's actual interference. "I don't know yet," I said honestly, "but I'm glad you're here now." She nodded, accepting that answer. "Your father wanted to come, but he thought you might not want to see him. He's so proud of you, though, for your strength, for getting justice for those young men." "Tell him I'll call him soon," I said. "We have a lot to talk about." Hayes and I drove to his apartment in silence, both of us emotionally exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through the hearing was fading, leaving behind the reality of what I'd done. My family would never be the same. Holidays would be divided, relationships permanently altered. I'd chosen justice over peace, and there was no going back. "Do you regret it?" Hayes asked as we sat on his couch, takeout containers unopened on the coffee table. "No," I said immediately. "Those men deserve to be heard. They deserve justice. Whatever it cost me, it was worth it." "What about us?" He turned to face me. "Our wedding is supposed to be in 3 months. Do you still want to get married? Or do you need time to process everything that's happened?" I'd been so focused on bringing Judith down that I'd barely thought about the wedding. The venue was booked, invitations sent, dress altered. We'd planned a celebration for 200 people, most of them family members who were now divided into armed camps. "I want to marry you," I said, "but I don't know if I want the wedding we planned. Not if it means trying to navigate which family members to invite, which side of the family to seat where, how to handle the fact that half our guests hate the other half." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "What if we eloped? Just us, a beach somewhere, no family drama." "Your parents would never forgive us." "My parents love you and want us to be happy. They'll understand." He took my hands. "Mackenzie, you've spent the past month fighting for justice for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Let me fight for us. Let me give you a wedding day that's about our future, not about your family's past." The idea was so tempting. No seating charts, no uncomfortable conversations, no risk that Judith's trial would overshadow everything. Just Hayes and me, and a commitment to build something better than what we'd come from. "A beach wedding?" I said slowly. "Small. Intimate. Maybe your parents and my brother. My grandmother, if she's up for traveling. And absolutely no one who's ever made you doubt yourself or made you feel like you needed to be smaller to keep the peace," Hayes added. I kissed him, grateful for a partner who understood that strength sometimes meant walking away from the battle, not just fighting it. We spent the rest of the evening planning our elopement, booking flights to a tiny island off the coast of Maine where neither of us had ever been. The trial was scheduled for 2 months later. Judith's lawyer tried every delay tactic possible, but Judge Holloway wasn't budging. The case would proceed as scheduled. In the meantime, 3 more victims came forward, men who'd seen the news code Judithage and recognized their own experiences in the testimony. Patricia was documenting their cases, building an even stronger pattern of behavior. Judith's trial lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution presented over 70 hours of testimony, hundreds of pieces of evidence, expert witnesses who demolished every defense theory Thompson tried to float. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Holloway sentenced Judith to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 15. As the sentence was read, Judith collapsed at the defense table, sobbing that this wasn't fair, that she'd been set up, that I'd destroyed her life out of petty jealousy. But the judge wasn't interested in Judith's excuses. You systematically targeted vulnerable young men, used your husband's position to manufacture authority over them, drugged them, assaulted them, and traumatized them. You showed no remorse throughout this trial, no acceptance of responsibility, no concern for the lives you destroyed. The sentence reflects the severity and duration of your crimes. I sat in the courtroom and watched Judith be led away in handcuffs for the final time. 25 years. She was 42 now, would be 67 when she was eligible for parole. Her beauty, the weapon she'd used to destroy so many lives, would be long faded by then. The power she'd wielded through sexuality would be gone. She would spend decades locked away, her reputation destroyed, her marriage ended, her place in the family erased. It was more than I'd dreamed of achieving when I'd first hired Patricia to follow Judith. It was justice, complete and devastating. Outside the courthouse, the 7 original victims had gathered with their families. Marcus hugged me, tears in his eyes. Thank you. For believing us. For fighting for us when we couldn't fight for ourselves. You fought, I corrected. You testified, you relived your trauma in public. You did the hard part. I just helped gather the evidence. Declan approached next, looking healthier than I'd seen him in years. I'm going back to law school, he said. Different school, different state, but I'm going back. I'm not letting what she did define the rest of my life. Good, I said, genuinely happy for him. You'll be a great lawyer. That evening, Hayes and I flew to Maine for our elopement. We were married on a beach at sunset, my grandmother and his parents the only witnesses, the ceremony lasting less than 10 minutes. We said vows we'd written ourselves, promises about protecting each other, believing each other, choosing each other every day. There was no drama, no family politics, no carefully managed seating charts. Just 2 people who'd survived a nightmare and decided to build something beautiful from the wreckage. 6 months later, I received a letter from Judith's prison. The return address made my stomach tighten, but curiosity won out over revulsion. I opened it while Hayes was at work, standing in our new apartment that we'd moved into after the trial. The letter was 3 pages of Judith's handwriting, small and cramped. It started with accusations, claims that I'd ruined her life, that the trial had been a witch hunt, that the victims had lied. But by the 2nd page, something shifted. I've had a lot of time to think in here. About the things I did, the people I hurt. My therapist says I have narcissistic personality disorder, that I genuinely believed I was entitled to whatever I wanted, whoever I wanted. She says that doesn't excuse my actions, but it explains them. The women in here know who I am, what I did. They don't like female predators any more than they like male ones. I've learned what it feels like to be powerless, to be targeted, to be afraid. I suppose you'd call that karma. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect you to care about my suffering. But I want you to know that I understand now what I stole from you, from those men, from everyone whose lives I touched. I understand that beauty and sexuality aren't weapons to be used against people. I understand that consent isn't negotiable. I'm sorry. I know it means nothing coming from me now, locked in here where I can't hurt anyone else. But I'm sorry. I read the letter 3 times, trying to determine if it was genuine or just another manipulation. In the end, I decided it didn't matter. Judith's understanding of what she'd done didn't undo the damage. Her apology didn't heal the scars she'd left. I burned the letter in the kitchen sink and never responded. My relationship with my family had evolved into something more selective. I saw my parents occasionally, always at neutral locations, always with clear boundaries. My mother was in therapy, working through her own complicity in ignoring Judith's behavior. My father had retired from his position at the school where Judith's trial had been the subject of endless gossip, moving to a small town where nobody knew our family's history. My grandmother, surprisingly, had thrived in the aftermath. She'd used the money she'd planned to leave Judith to establish a scholarship fund for young men pursuing legal careers who'd experienced sexual trauma. The applications poured in, far more than we'd anticipated, each one a reminder of how common and how silenced male victimization was. Marcus had graduated law school and was working at a firm that specialized in victims' rights. Declan was in his final year, planning to focus on criminal defense. Owen had returned to law school after 5 years away, finally ready to face the profession that had been tainted by Judith's abuse. 3 of them had become friends, supporting each other through their recoveries, occasionally meeting for dinner where they could talk about their experiences without shame. They'd invited me once, wanting to thank me, but I'd declined. This was their healing journey, not mine. I'd played my part by helping them get justice. The rest was theirs to navigate. Hayes and I had settled into married life with surprising ease. We'd learned to communicate better through the crucible of Judith's trial, to trust each other's judgment, to fight together instead of against each other. Our tiny beach wedding had been featured in a local newspaper's human interest section, a story about choosing love over drama, intimacy over spectacle. My career had taken an unexpected turn after the trial. A victims' advocacy organization had reached out, asking if I'd consider joining their board. My investigative skills and willingness to fight powerful predators made me valuable to their work. I'd accepted, channeling the intensity Hayes had once worried about into helping other victims build cases against their abusers. I'd helped 2 women gather evidence against their former bosses, documenting patterns of sexual harassment. I'd assisted a young man in exposing a teacher who'd groomed him. Each case reminded me why I'd burned my family relationships to the ground to get justice, because some things were worth fighting for, even when the cost was high. On the 1-year anniversary of Judith's sentencing, the 7 original victims organized a gathering. They invited me, Hayes, Jennifer the prosecutor, Patricia the investigator, and Richard, who'd spent the year dismantling his law firm and establishing new ethics guidelines at his new practice. We met at a restaurant overlooking the river, the same river where Judith had once held court at expensive hotels, using beauty and manipulation to destroy lives. Now those lives were being rebuilt, stronger for having been broken and reconstructed. Marcus stood and raised his glass. To Mackenzie, who believed us when nobody else would, who fought for us when we couldn't fight for ourselves, who showed us that justice isn't just possible, it's worth pursuing no matter the cost. To Mackenzie, the others echoed. I felt tears prick my eyes as I looked around the table. These men who'd been so traumatized that some had changed careers, moved states, given up on dreams, were now thriving. They'd faced their abuser in court, seen her convicted, watched her led away to prison. They'd reclaimed their power and their futures. To all of you, I said, raising my own glass, for your courage, for your willingness to relive trauma in service of justice, for showing the world that victims can be any gender, and justice should be blind to everything except truth. Richard cleared his throat. I'd like to say something, if that's all right. He looked older than his 60 years, the trial having aged him visibly. I enabled Judith by refusing to see what she was doing, by prioritizing reputation over reality, power over people. I can't undo the harm my willful blindness caused, but I can ensure it doesn't happen again. He pulled out his phone and showed us a website. I've established a foundation for male victims of sexual assault and harassment, free legal services, therapy resources, support groups. It's funded entirely by my personal assets, no connection to my firm or professional reputation. It's the least I can do to make amends for the years I looked the other way. The table was quiet for a moment. Then Declan spoke up. That's incredible, Richard. Thank you. The evening continued with lighter conversation, stories of career successes and personal growth. Owen announced he'd gotten engaged. Marcus shared that he'd been promoted to junior partner at his firm. Declan talked about his plans to work at a legal aid clinic after graduation. As the night wound down and people started leaving, Hayes and I stood by the river, watching the lights reflect on the water. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't exposed her? He asked. Every day, I admitted. I wonder how many more men she would have hurt. How many more careers she would have destroyed. How long she would have gotten away with it if I'd stayed silent. Do you regret the cost? Your family relationships, the gossip, the scrutiny? I thought about my fractured family, about cousins who no longer spoke to me, about holidays spent with Hayes's family instead of my own. I thought about the price of being the one who refused to keep quiet, who valued truth over peace. No, I said finally. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that nobody stopped her sooner, but I don't regret doing what needed to be done. 3 months later, I received notice that Judith had been attacked by another inmate. Nothing life-threatening, just a reminder that predators aren't safe anywhere, even in prison. I felt nothing when I read the report, no satisfaction, no sympathy. Judith had become irrelevant to my life, a chapter closed and filed away. What mattered now was the foundation Richard had established, the scholarship fund my grandmother managed, the 3 young lawyers who'd overcome trauma to pursue justice careers. What mattered was the message we'd sent, that predators could be any gender, victims could be any gender, and justice was possible when people refused to stay silent. Hayes and I were expecting our first child, a daughter we'd already named Lily. I thought often about the world she'd grow up in, hoping it would be one where victims were believed, where power couldn't shield predators, where speaking truth was valued over keeping peace. I thought about the lessons I'd learned from bringing down Judith, that patience and evidence were more powerful than anger, that justice sometimes required sacrifice, that protecting others was worth the personal cost. Most of all, I'd learned that family wasn't defined by blood or obligation, but by who showed up when it mattered, who believed you when you told the truth, who fought beside you instead of demanding you stay silent for the sake of peace. My family now consisted of Hayes, my grandmother, a handful of cousins who'd chosen truth over tradition, and 7 men who'd survived a predator and lived to build better futures. It was smaller than the family I'd grown up with, but infinitely stronger. On quiet evenings, I sometimes thought about that Sunday dinner, about the moment I'd slid the envelope across the table and watched Judith's perfect facade begin to crack. That had been the beginning of the end for her, the first domino in a chain that led to prison. But it had been the beginning of something else for me. A life built on truth instead of silence, strength instead of submission, justice instead of peace at any price. Judith would spend the next 15 years minimum behind bars, her beauty fading, her power gone, her reputation destroyed beyond repair. The woman who'd once commanded attention in every room now commanded only the 6x8 cell where she'd spend the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, I was building a life, raising a daughter, helping other victims find their voices. The contrast wasn't lost on me. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living well while your enemy withers. It's building something beautiful from the wreckage they created. It's refusing to let their destruction define you. Judith had tried to make me small, to convince me I wasn't enough to keep a boyfriend, wasn't worthy of love or respect. She'd failed. I'd proven myself capable of investigation, prosecution, revolution. I'd proven that speaking truth had power, that evidence could topple empires, that one determined woman could bring down a predator who'd operated with impunity for years. The last time I thought about Judith was the day Lily was born. As I held my daughter and looked into her eyes, I made a silent promise. She would grow up knowing that her voice mattered, that truth was worth fighting for, that no one, family or stranger, man or woman, had the right to make her feel small or powerless. And if anyone ever tried, they'd learn the same lesson Judith had learned too late, that underestimating a woman's determination to protect what she loves is a fatal mistake.